remember your reaction on September 11th? Like many of you in our offices in Wisconsin, we gathered around the nearest television set watching the events unfold. And when the second plane hit, it was clear that it was a terrorist attack. Did you get the same sick feeling in the pit of your stomach as you watched? It was horrifying. First there was shock, and then a great sadness, and finally anger as we realized the loss of life and property. But as always, when such tragedy and such treachery strike America, America's character began to kick in. Even before the attack was over, Jeremy Glick and others on that 757 over Pennsylvania began to move into action in the spirit that has made the greatest country the world's ever known. His battle cry, "Let's roll," belongs with the battle cries of many other American heroes of our past. Courageous firemen and policemen rushed to the scene and tried to help the victims at the World Trade Center. And many of those lost their lives when the towers collapsed. They sacrificed everything for their fellow Americans. We may never know how many lives were saved by their sacrifice and quick action. And then something extraordinary began to happen. All of America began to stir. The outpouring of support from all across America proved once again to the world the large heart of this nation. Prayers were everywhere, prominent and unashamed, even among politicians, and political correctness faded into the background, at least for a while. Contributions from people of all economic levels and ages poured in. Singers wrote songs. Even the famous gave of their time and wealth. And Old Glory sprung from closets and drawers. Flag makers were flooded with orders, and virtually every front porch, car, and lapel in America began to blossom with good old-fashioned American patriotism. But while Americans were talking U.S., our leaders were strangely talking UN. How many of you rushed out in the days that followed September 11th and bought or flew a United Nations flag? I thought not. And what was the reaction of the United Nations just a stone's throw from ground zero at the World Trade Center? What did Kofi Annan and the leadership at the UN do in the days that followed when the terrorist attack and its network of terror became apparent to us all? Well, the UN did act within a few weeks. They acted while the rescue workers still pulled bodies from the smoking rubble to put Syria, yes, Syria, the same nation that tops the list of terrorist nations on our State Department's list of terror sponsors, onto the UN Security Council. This secret ballot vote in the General Assembly was amazing. Only 17 nations voted against Syria. Even our U.S. State Department appointed delegation abstained. That's right, they didn't even cast a protest vote. As you watch the events of September 11th and the days that followed, you may have asked yourself one of these questions. How did this happen? Who could do this? Will there be more attacks? And what can be done to help? When I'm finished speaking, I hope you will be able to add one more question. Why on earth would our leaders go to the United Nations for help in a battle against terror? Before we're finished, you will have answers, and you will know what you can do to help. An explanation of our reaction as members of the John Birch Society might be in order. We certainly shared many of your emotions that day, but our reaction may have been somewhat different from the average American. First of all, we knew that this could happen. In fact, those of us who have studied terrorism prayed that it would not, but expected something like this. Why? I'd like to quote an article titled "American-Made Terrorists" in this, the October 12, 1998 edition of the New American Magazine, a publication of the John Birch Society. In this article, nearly 3 years before the attack, our senior editor, William F. Jasper, said this: and I quote, "We have no hope of winning the war against terrorism than we have had in our failed war against drugs if we allow our leaders and policymakers to continue to subsidize and support and treat as allies the principal state sponsors of terrorism. As long as the U.S. and other Western nations pretend not to see and understand the Russian and Chinese hands behind international terrorism, and continue to pretend that Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, the PLO, Libya, Iran, Syria et al. Are independent actors, we will see the victim corpses of terrorism pile higher and higher." Mr. Jasper would not claim to be a prophet, nor would I or any other member I know. We have simply learned the truth from a 43-year accumulation of knowledge at the John Birch Society. Tonight we'll explain why Mr. Jasper could be so assured that this would be a no-win war if our leaders continue to treat as allies the sponsors of terror. Now, engaging in no-win wars is a growing habit of American policy and leadership. One example is the so-called war on drugs, in which the enemy is linked to and often sponsored by the same Russian and Chinese and surrogate communist nations. An interesting book called Deep Cover is a very good insider's view of this war on drugs. The author, Michael Levine, made a summation. It's on the flyleaf of the book. And here it is. "It is both sobering and painful to realize after 25 years of undercover work, having personally accounted for at least 3,000 criminals serving 15,000 years in jail, and having seized several tons of various illegal substances, that my career was meaningless and that I had had absolutely no effect whatsoever in the so-called war on drugs. The war itself is a fraud." Close quote. Another expert with vast experience in drug interdiction is Dr. Joseph Douglas, author of the authoritative book Red Cocaine. Dr. Douglas is recognized even by the U.S. government, which has brought him in for his expertise on a number of occasions. He toured for the John Birch Society. He told us that Russian and Chinese intelligence played the major role in the construction of the international drug network. They built a huge chain of self-funding production and transportation systems designed to ensure a flood of drugs into America and the West. But as Mr. Jasper indicated, our political leaders and media do not tell us about the state sponsors of the problem, China, Russia, and their surrogate nations. Other no-win wars since 1945 have been quite numerous. There's the war on poverty and the runaway welfare state that resulted. The war on crime, which ignores criminals and instead punishes honest citizens with gun control and other legislation. Korea was a costly no-win stalemate with communism and terror. Vietnam, another costly no-win war with communist terror and revolution, ending in a frustrating withdrawal. The Gulf War, although declared a victory, ended with UN inspectors calling the shots. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Saddam Hussein still in charge and at large in Iraq? Somalia, Haiti, the Balkans, Macedonia. Now our military is sending advisors to Chechnya. That's right, Chechnya, to help the Russians keep a former possession in line. The list of no-win wars is growing. Let's look at the international terrorist network and the war on terrorism that we're currently engaged in. A respected investigative journalist, published in Reader's Digest and many other nationally recognized publications, Claire Sterling, used her journalistic talent in the early 1970s and late 60s to investigate the international terrorist network. The result was a very authoritative 1981 book called The Terror Network, The Secret War of International Terrorism. This intensely researched book gives great insight into the international terrorist network and its roots and our government's reactions to it. It details the overwhelming evidence that proves that this terror network was built by Russian and Chinese intelligence networks. She also exposes a trend toward U.S. administrative denial that this international terror problem even exists. A striking case in point was when one of President Carter's advisors, his advisor on terrorism in the National Security Council, after reviewing this very carefully researched book, told Claire Sterling, quote, "You don't really believe all this bunk about international terrorism, do you?" We certainly believe it now. This raises another question. How can you defeat an enemy that you deny even exists? Let's look at the roots of the international terrorist network, identified now by our leaders as the enemy in this war on terror. For decades, we've been lied to about this terror network. A bloody 20th century was marked by Russian and Chinese domination and leadership, and communist state sponsors of terror are still flourishing today. This is surprising to many Americans given the highly touted death or demise of communism in the 1990s. But numerous nations that we were told had rejected communism at that time have re-elected communist majorities or communist governments. Just a few days ago, Hungary re-elected a communist or socialist majority to their parliament. Communist dictatorships and revolutions still span the globe, with communist China, communist Cuba, just 90 miles from our southern shores. The most populous nation on earth, China, is still virulently communist and actively involved in terror. The evidence of Chinese involvement in the terror network is quite prevalent. China had a friendly relationship with the Taliban right up to and including and beyond September 11th. There were Chinese advisors when we arrived there. China's communist leader, Mao Zedong, was an eager participant in the drug network described by Dr. Douglas. As a matter of fact, in his own writings, he described it as, quote, chemical warfare by indigenous methods. China manages the drug trade through the triad gangs, or Chinese mafia today. A potent form of heroin nicknamed Afghan White is produced in the northern provinces of Afghanistan by members of the Northern Alliance, our new allies, and marketed through the Chinese. China is unequaled in history in terrorism against their very own people. Terror is a part of Chinese life. The 1997 Guinness Book of World Records listed China as the record holder for mass murder of their own citizens. And strangely, somehow by 1998, that listing had been removed. Remember Tiananmen Square? The reward from our State Department was Most Favored Nation trading status. In January of this year, a pastor and an importer were sentenced to death in China. The pastor for preaching, the importer for bringing Bibles into the country. The crimes were described by the Chinese government as, quote, using an evil cult to damage a law-based society, and, quote, importing illegal publications. Welcome to the new and friendly China, our trading partner. George W. Bush expressed concern, but permanent normal trade relations have continued unbroken. And the profits from this slave labor are used to build and strengthen a mortal enemy. Have you tried to find anything at Walmart lately that isn't made in China? Our State Department feebly called on China to meet, quote, international standards on freedom of religious expression and freedom of conscience as embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, produced by the United Nations. Apparently, they couldn't find their copy of the United States Constitution and the First Amendment, which give a clear definition of true religious freedom. But sadly, China can claim they already comply with the UDHR. During the debates on the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a communist spokesman from the Soviet Union stated, "The rights of human beings cannot be considered outside the prerogatives of governments, and the very understanding of human rights is a government concept." You see, nearly all communists agree with the UDHR. In both views, all rights can be done away with by simple act of law, if government so desires. In sharp contrast, the U.S. view, as embodied in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, maintain that rights are given by God and government's duty, sole duty, is to protect those rights. In China, you can add to their domestic terror their support of North Vietnam and that massive terrorist attack on South Vietnam, sponsorship of the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, who were responsible for Cambodia's killing fields and the death of a quarter of her population, sponsorship of 40 years of insurrection and murder in the Philippines, and the cold-blooded brutalization of Tibet and her peaceful people. Genocide is what's practiced there. Genocide that the UN claims to oppose. The Chinese even demanded that the Dalai Lama be excluded from the so-called UN Conference on World Religions, and the United Nations complied. China is steeped in terror. China, as you might recall, is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. How about Russia? Russia is still chief ally and trading partner of dozens of terrorist sponsor states. Prominent among those receiving aid from these Russian surrogates was Osama bin Laden. The Red Brigades on March 30th claimed credit, if you can call it that, for the death of an Italian high-ranking official on his doorstep in front of his family. They don't think that the revolution is over. And members of this organization, the Red Brigades, aided bin Laden, if you remember the news accounts, in Germany and elsewhere. Terrorist attacks are not uncommon in Europe or Asia today, conducted by these same groups like the Red Brigades. In February 1993, bombs were detonated in the parking garage of the World Trade Center, killing 6 and injuring 650. An Iraqi named Ramzi Youssef was named and later convicted of that crime along with several others who had ties to bin Laden. Iraq has a well-publicized arrangement with Russia. We faced Russian armor in the deserts of Iraq, and Russia was the only nation to complain about the war on Iraq. Later, in 1996, a building housing American military personnel in Saudi Arabia was heavily damaged by a truck bomb. 19 Americans died. 300 other Americans and Saudis were wounded. The attack, after an after-the-fact investigation, named bin Laden again as the mastermind with ties to Libya, yet another Russian ally. The name of bin Laden figures in each of these attacks. In 1998, terrorists attacked U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 12 Americans and dozens of embassy employees. And bin Laden was named again, along with Libya and other surrogate nations of the Soviet Union. By the way, the idea of surrogate nations is deniability. The Russians are able to say, we didn't do it. We had nothing to do with it, while supplying and funding and directing the efforts through surrogate nations. In 2000, suicide bombers blew a hole in the USS Scholl in Aden in Yemen, and again, bin Laden was named as the mastermind. 17 dead, many wounded. In fact, almost every attack that we have suffered on Americans and American interests traces directly back to Russian and Chinese surrogate nations who still receive funding from those nations. Bear in mind that Russia is also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Like the UN, the U.S. State Department has developed a serious blindness where terrorist sponsor nations are concerned, but only on the left side. The same left side blindness also infects our major media where terror is concerned. This blindness is obvious in the case of Cuba, Fidel Castro, and his Russian communist ties. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was given a green light by our foreign policy experts in the 1950s. He was even given the name the Robin Hood of the Sierra Maestra Mountains by Jules Dubois of the Chicago Tribune, and it was echoed in Look magazine. Herbert Matthews in the New York Times stated flatly that there was no trace of communism in this man's camp. Our U.S. ambassador on the scene disagreed. He saw Castro for what he was, and the U.S. State Department's reaction was to remove him and replace him with someone friendlier to Castro's forces. Cuba quickly became the most prolific sponsor of terror in Central and South America, even building and directing the Tricontinental Network, identified by Claire Sterling as one of the major terrorist networks in the world. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? In the 1980s, Cuba even expanded their terrorist actions to Africa, sending troops, uniformed troops, to Angola and support troops to many other nations in Africa. Throughout his brutal regime in Cuba, Fidel Castro has been warmly welcomed and applauded on the floor of the General Assembly at the United Nations. As a matter of fact, the vote to end sanctions against Cuba in the United Nations General Assembly was held last November 29th. Cuba sponsored this legislation. The vote, 167-3 against the United States. Only Israel and the Marshall Islands joined us. On the continent of Africa, Russia has been a prolific sponsor of terror. A decade ago, the UN, international media, and the U.S. State Department aided Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, or ANC. Sanctions and political pressure were put on the pro-Western government of South Africa, while the African National Congress tortured and murdered their way to a new communist-dominated state. Did you know, by the way, that Mandela's mentor and sponsor of the ANC, his guide and trainer, was a white Lithuanian and a colonel in Russian intelligence by the name of Joe Slavo? I guess that didn't get much press, but when Slavo died, the truth was exposed. How did the ANC operate? Well, on July 25th in Cape Town, South Africa, these ANC freedom fighters, as they called themselves, lobbed 3 grenades into the 1,500-member congregation of St. James Church in the middle of a service, in the middle of a hymn, and then opened fire on the helpless congregation with automatic weapons. 11 were killed, 53 wounded, and the toll would have been much worse, as it was in other events, except for 21-year-old Gerald Harker, who threw himself on a grenade that fell in the midst of a group of women and children, sacrificing his life to save many lives. His 13-year-old brother did not survive. And Charles Van Wyck, who was sitting in one of the back pews, happened to have with him that day a 6-shot revolver and 6 rounds of ammunition. Firing at these brave freedom fighters with automatic weapons and grenades, he caused them to retreat and flee before any more damage could be done. The next day, hundreds of supporters marched by the church in protest of the arrest of the attackers. They chanted, "One settler, one bullet, one minister, one bullet, one church, one bomb." Today, South Africa is very different indeed under Nelson Mandela. 20 years ago, South Africa was one of the 10 most prosperous nations on earth, the 12th largest exporter of goods. Black citizens had the best schools, the highest standard of living, the lowest unemployment rate in all of Africa. They were the first nation on earth whose doctors performed a transplant of a heart. And thousands of Africans from the northern nations fled illegally across their borders into South Africa seeking a better life and a better standard of living. Not a horrible place by their standards. Tourism was a major industry. Today, crime in Mr. Mandela, South Africa, is setting global records. The statistics on rape, robbery, murder, carjacking, assault all show increases of between 200 and 1,200%. Thousands are dying. Travel agencies warn against going to South Africa at all, and the economy is in a shambles with unemployment officially 26.5%, unofficially double that. Corruption and brutality are widespread. And in South Africa, since the communists have taken power for some strange reason, it doesn't seem that communist terror is newsworthy to the international media. It doesn't seem to bother our U.S. State Department, and it certainly doesn't bother the United Nations. There have been no protests. Nelson Mandela and other ANC thugs, in fact, are cheered at the United Nations, praised by our State Department, and entertained at our White House by George Bush. Another frequent beneficiary of State Department and UN aid is the virtual poster child of international terrorism, Yasser Arafat, and his PLO, or Palestine Liberation Organization. One headline reports Kofi Annan's view. It says, UN chief says only Arafat can advance Mideast peace process. Promoted as a liberator of the people like all communist terror chiefs are, Arafat was an asset of Russian intelligence. We know that. Trained and educated in the Soviet Union. He received a constant flow of aid throughout the life of his organizations. Even the recent shipment of arms that was intercepted on its way to his terrorist groups was produced almost entirely in Russian bloc nations. Today, Arafat supervises some of the bloodiest terrorists on earth. Our daily papers are a testimony to that fact. His choice and selection of supermarkets, buses, and crowded restaurants at midday is testimony to his lack of concern about the women and children and innocents that are slaughtered. Years ago, the PLO was about to be wiped out by the Israeli army. The U.S. State Department and protests from the UN pulled their bacon out of the fire. They were rescued. I wrote this segment some 6 weeks prior to giving this presentation. And just a few days ago, President Bush notified the world that our State Department was going to work diligently in compliance with demands by the United Nations to rescue Arafat and his terrorists from the Israeli army once again. How can you equate our war on terror with our support and our concern about Yasser Arafat and his bloody terrorists? Thousands of innocents have died since the last rescue, and thousands more will die if we do it again. How about Muammar Gaddafi in Libya? Gaddafi's roots go deep at the UN. Why is he still in power after so many years as an obvious and proven sponsor of terror? Gaddafi and Libya are responsible for the second most infamous terrorist behind Osama bin Laden. This Russian-sponsored killer from Libya, Abu Nidal, is implicated in the Pan American bombing that killed hundreds over Lockerbie, Scotland. Contrary to the urban legend that sprung up after September 11th regarding Osama bin Laden, it was not he that Ollie North feared. As a matter of fact, in North's testimony he said, Abu Nidal, who tried to kill me, my wife, my children, my dog, had a map. There were 7 of them. On their way to my house on February 11th, 1987, thank God, arrested by the FBI. They put 35 federal agents to live with my family and me from that day until I retired from the Marines. That guy works for guess who? Muammar Gaddafi, end quote. So 14 years ago, in 1987, we knew the role of Abu Nidal. We knew exactly what he was. Ollie North worked for both the Marines and the CIA. Gaddafi is also cheered as a frequent and welcome guest on the General Assembly floor at the UN, and Libya participates in virtually every activity. Tell me, do you think anyone will put 35 agents in your home if Abu Nidal decides to visit you? I seriously doubt it. Syria, I mentioned earlier, another new ally at the UN. They have a long and bloody history of terror sponsor. We have a 6-inch thick file in our files in Appleton, Wisconsin, just on the topic of Syria and terror. The United Nations, I submit to you, is in fact terrorists are us. You know, the truth is often spoken in jest. A cartoon that I ran across after September 11th makes a very, very good point. It shows George W. Bush dressed as the sheriff in a small Old West town. And he's eyeing 3 nasty-looking criminal types walking down the street, heavily armed and labeled Northern Alliance, Syria, and Iran. He turns to his deputy and says, "Whoa, better round up the posse." And his deputy, portrayed by Colin Powell, whispers in his ear, "That is the posse." What's missing is all of the other terrorist nation sponsors from the United Nations like Russia, China, Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Vietnam, Cuba, South Africa, and a host of others who hold power and votes on both the Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN. The UN's record is clear. The UN has been pro-terrorist and pro-communist for its entire existence. Documents that I have with me today, reports from the UNDP, or United Nations Development Program, in 1979 list as recipients of millions of dollars in aid the Patriotic Front, Pan-African Congress, African National Congress, and the Southwest African People's Organization, all well-known Soviet-backed terror organizations. It's their document, ladies and gentlemen, not mine. A half-century-old example is found in the province of Katanga in the old colony of Africa known as the Belgian Congo. In the late 1950s, communists and their sympathizers, along with international media and the UN, demanded the end to colonialism in Africa. And in 1960, the U.S. State Department and UN Security Council voted to demand that Belgium abandon the Congo to quote-unquote black rule. Previous to this, the Communist Terror Network had sponsored Patrice Lumumba, a vicious terrorist thug. The Communists were so fond of him, they named a university in Russia, Lumumba University. When Belgium withdrew, Lumumba took over and launched a reign of terror, killing, raping, and maiming men, women, and children. Katanga, an anti-communist and primarily Christian province of Katanga, withdrew from the Congo and declared its independence. In 1961, the UN, under strong U.S. State Department approval, sent a large contingent of UN troops into the Congo, not to protect the fledgling nation of Katanga, but to attack it and force it back under the umbrella of Patrice Lumumba's communist government. That's right. UN troops systematically destroyed radio stations, newspapers, and television stations so the news could not reach Americans and the rest of the world. They bombed clearly marked hospitals and ambulances painted white with red crosses on top and sides. They machine-gunned civilians, men, women, and children. That's right, some of them parked at checkpoints. And once in control, the UN put the communist government back over Katanga. How many of our American people are even aware of this tragedy or the role played by the UN? Perhaps you won't accept the overwhelming factual evidence presented by the John Birch Society. But there's no need to. There are others that chronicle this outrage. 46 doctors from Elizabethville in Katanga, doctors from Belgium, Italy, Hungary, Spain, Switzerland. These doctors witnessed the attack and wrote a protest booklet, 46 Angry Men. It's not pleasant reading. What about UN conferences and UN programs? Where do they fit in? And what role do terrorists play? How about, for example, the United Nations Millennium Summit of World Leaders, touted by UN promoters as, quote, one of the most important gatherings of the last 1,000 years. Appointed by the UN to co-chair this gathering was Sam Nujoma. Sam Nujoma is president of Namibia and former head of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, one of the bloodiest terror sponsors, terrorist organizations, and Soviet-backed terror groups in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The UN press office said of Mr. Nujoma, he became the first leader of an African nationalist movement seeking independence to address the United Nations Security Council. In fact, many others have since addressed the UN Security Council, and many of them sit in the UN General Assembly. Just days prior to the terrorist attack on September 11th, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was in, of all places, Durban, South Africa, to attend a UN summit, a UN World Conference on racism. Prominent attendees, Yasser Arafat and Fidel Castro. Conference was hosted by South African President Thabo Mbeki, a former leader of the African National Congress. During the 80s, Mbeki's comrades in the ANC perfected a technique known as necklacing, in which a rubber tire was placed about the neck, gasoline or diesel was poured over the victim in the tire, and the victim's hands were tied behind his back with piano wire. The victim had a choice of sawing through his own flesh to pull the tire from his head, or dying slowly in the burning rubber and flames. At the conference, Kofi Annan referred to the ANC and South Africa as, quote, a beacon of enlightenment and hope, not only for a troubled continent, but for the entire world. He went on to say, we salute the heroic movement you represent. The whole conference was permeated by a let's get the USA mentality. So bad, in fact, that the entire U.S. delegation, liberals that they are, went home on the second day. The major topic was reparations from U.S. citizens for slavery of 150 years ago. Interestingly, the conference was attended by Sudan. Never censored by the UN, Sudan today has state-sponsored terrorism in its own provinces against Christians and Christian churches, in which as many as 130 Christians have been massacred in the middle of a church service by government-sponsored terrorists And slavery is in full swing. Christians are captured and sold literally as slaves in the Sudan today. And the practice continues. Ruth Wiss, writing for the Weekly Standard, chronicled hundreds of anti-Semitic statements, actions, decisions, and rhetoric by UN leaders, all of which is ignored by the press. How can our leaders be so blind to the obvious terrorist bent of the United Nations? Why is communist and UN racism and anti-Semitism acceptable to the media? Our leaders' positions and decisions regarding the United Nations and terrorism just don't make much sense unless there is a plan for world government under the United Nations, and some of them are in on it. Remember the Soviet response on human rights I mentioned earlier? The rights of human beings cannot be considered outside the prerogatives of governments, and their very understanding of human rights is a government concept. Interestingly, that is precisely the position and precisely the language of the United Nations and the United Nations Charter. How did it get that way? Well, in America today, there's an uneasiness about the growing power of federal government, and there's also a cartoon which makes a good example of this concern. Some bureaucrat is shown browbeating a local citizen, and he tells the citizen, "Stop questioning your government. How dare you question your government? Shut up and wave your flag." Attorney General John Ashcroft, on December 6th, to the Senate Judiciary Committee said this: "To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this. Your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity, diminish our resolve, they give ammunition to America's enemies." In other words, if you complain about the loss of your freedoms, you're giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Those are frightening words. 200 years ago, James Madison cautioned us that the people only give up their liberty under some pretense, some delusion. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans are beginning to see that terrorism is the smokescreen, and the delusion is that the UN is the solution. For the UN to rule, we must lose our independence. And that reflects another serious issue over which Americans have been kept in the dark: our internal security, our ability to protect ourselves from terrorism. Congressional investigations have been dismantled, while FBI and local police investigations have been systematically crippled for 60 years. The most important and destructive move at the federal level occurred in May 1976. Attorney General Edward Levy, a left-wing appointee of Republican President Ford, was a member of the pro-communist National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild, proven again and again in investigations to be a KGB or Russian intelligence front. They defended Cuba in every single action of Cuba against Americans and American interests. Levy mandated new guidelines restricting terrorist investigations by all law enforcement. And these guidelines prevented law enforcement from using informants unless there was a direct threat of violence already detected. Angry law enforcement officials and FBI agents at the time noted publicly that they had become unable to do their jobs until after a bomb exploded. As a result, with 21,000 investigations in 1973, before this decision, there were only 73 in 1978 and 20 in 1982. No wonder we're a sieve for terrorists. Even when caught, the terrorists are coddled or even rewarded. In 1980, the leaders of the underground group Weather Underground, leftist terrorists linked to communism, turned themselves in. Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn were pretty sure that they wouldn't be punished for their numerous crimes, and they were right. Charges were dropped. The judge cited what she termed improper surveillance against them under the Levy guidelines. Terrorist Ayers would later boast that they had bombed the Capitol and the Pentagon and were planning to bomb the White House. Are those familiar targets of leftist terror today? And Ayers is now a teacher at the University of Chicago. Dohrn teaches at Northwestern University. What about the war in Afghanistan, which seems to have bogged down a bit? Where is it going? Have you heard it'll be over when we've accomplished this, or it'll be over by such and such a date? No, Instead, it's just constant references to a long war or an open-ended war. Internationalist and UN cheerleader Lincoln P. Bloomfield in the early 1960s, complained, quote, that there is insufficient impetus to propel nations to accept world government anytime soon, but that the process could be accelerated by creating or manipulating crises, end quote. We've been told over and over, haven't we, the only way to fight terror is through the United Nations? Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, in an editorial in the New York Times, said this: "It'll be a war like none other our nation has faced. It'll involve floating coalitions of countries which may change, grow, and evolve. This is not a war against an individual, a group, or country. Rather, our opponent is a global network of terrorist organizations and their state sponsors. Forget about exit strategies. We're looking at a sustained engagement that carries no deadlines." Why would our State Department only now realize we're facing a global network of terror when Claire Sterling told them 20 years ago? Why would we be willing to engage in a war that carries no deadlines rather than claiming a victory and aiming at a victory? This war on terrorism certainly fits Lincoln P. Bloomfield's prescription for world government. The UN from its beginnings has been a deception. The UN's history is one of communism and a drive for world government. For many years, the shadowy slogan, "The New World Order," was described as a paranoid delusion by the media. But it's a real agenda. In 1991, this New World Order was revealed and spoken by George H.W. Bush, speaking during the Gulf War. He called it a goal. Before that, only internationalists and the John Birch Society, and perhaps a handful of others, were even aware of the terminology. Interestingly, in almost every category of media, New World and Order were capitalized. Another interesting individual in the news who's been talking about the New World Order lately is Mikhail Gorbachev, who you might remember with a little research was the head of Russian intelligence during almost the entire period that the international terrorist network was being built. Mikhail Gorbachev, former leader of communist Soviet Union, said, speaking of Bill Clinton, "I fault him for not doing enough to foster the New World Order while he had the chance," end quote. The brainchild of Edward Mandell House, the League of Nations, a forerunner to the UN, was touted as a solution for peace after World War I. The U.S. Senate realized that it was, in fact, a template for world government and soundly rejected it, only to see it resurrected, dusted off, and renamed in 1945, at which time the American Senate accepted it. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to note that in the U.S. Senate, the individual who led the charge for the UN was an individual by the name Senator Al Gore Sr. Senator Al Gore Sr. quit the Senate several years later to accept a very lucrative position with a large oil company called Occidental Petroleum Company. If you know the history of Occidental Petroleum Company, then you know that Armand Hammer, who died in recent years, was the billionaire in charge. Armand Hammer's father was Julius Hammer, and it was Julius Hammer who founded the American Communist Party. Suspicions of slanted news reporting from major media have turned to cheerleading that is obvious. The New Republic, on January 17, 2000, New Republic magazine had a title article, a cover article called "World Government is Coming, Deal with It." The author, senior editor for the New Republic, and even more shocking, the author stated in the article that this UN-led world government was a good idea. Another shocking story is the story of Alger Hiss, a State Department employee. The role he played in creating the UN is clear proof of the UN's communist roots. Alger Hiss was a State Department rising star during World War II. He was at President Franklin Roosevelt's elbow during every negotiation with Joseph Stalin, the leading communist, during World War II. He was eventually sent to prison for perjury after lying about and being caught and convicted for his ties to self-confessed courier for the Communist Party, Whittaker Chambers. He also lied about direct contact with other high-ranking members of the Communist Party. This was again confirmed from files that became available during the turmoil in the Soviet Union during the early 1990s. During his career in the State Department, Alger Hiss received promotion after promotion. He was the man appointed to be America's chief delegate to the United Nations Founding Conference in San Francisco in 1945. And Hiss personally handpicked all but one or two of the 46 or 47 member delegation. He even served as acting Secretary General at the conference in 1945, and at the 1944 Dumbarton Oaks Conference, he acted as Executive Secretary. He and a Soviet agent by the name of V.M. Molotov, sent here by Stalin, drafted the UN Charter. A secret Soviet agent and an open Soviet agent. They couldn't lose, could they? You see, we're asked to believe that Hiss and his hand-picked staff were present in San Francisco to protect American interests. And if you believe that, I have some swampland you might be interested in. Americans don't know the roots of the UN. They don't know the role of Alger Hiss. They don't know how communist this organization really is and how deeply those roots have penetrated American soil and American government. The UN's reach is enormous. It infects and invades virtually every aspect of life in every nation on earth. A paid advertisement in the New York Times on February 18, 2000, titled "In Response to Senator Helms," was a reference to Senator Helms' comments on the UN. The advertisement pictured former U.S. Congressman John B. Anderson as the leader of this organization, the World Federalist Association. The subhead is even more interesting. It reads, "Cronkite and Clinton make a strong case for recasting the United Nations as a world federation." Elitist international groups like this have enormous power and clout and set national and international policy for the U.S. They also have heavy clout on both sides of the political aisle at the very top. In a quote from this ad, we find that, quote, "Walter Cronkite received the World Federalist Association Norman Cousins Global Governance Award for his promotion of world government in his autobiography, A Reporter's Life." Here's a quote. "We need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government to deal with world problems." This is a man who supposedly delivered unbiased news to the American people for almost 50 years. By the way, the ad quotes in support of Mr. Cronkite, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, who swore an oath to the U.S. Constitution to uphold it, and his wife Hillary Clinton, who congratulated Cronkite at the event by closed-circuit TV. You're familiar now with Katanga. Elements of our State Department have betrayed virtually all our friends and helped virtually all our enemies. In Korea, it was the State Department that allowed the crippling of the military effort through UN mismanagement of the military. In Iran, while the communists were busy building their terror organization, we were knocking down the Shah and neglecting him, watching him vilified at the UN. Now Iran is a hotbed of radicalism and a frequent sponsor of terror. They paid $100,000 each to the families of the suicide bombers just recently. Now Iran is an enemy. How about Iraq and Saddam Hussein? Have you ever wondered how the State Department and Soviet Frankenstein monster got us to stop short in the so-called Gulf War, leaving the Republican Guard and Saddam Hussein untouched? Who gave the order to halt? In charge of our military at that time was today's major UN coalition builder and apologist and fan of the UN, our Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He told the Washington Times just after September 11th that he was, quote, "seeking UN approval to defend our nation," and said, quote, "that we have the authority to take whatever means necessary to defend our nation, and that that authority is based on Article 51 of the UN Charter." What happened to the U.S. Constitution? I submit to you, if we can only defend ourselves under the authority of the UN Charter, we're in deep trouble already. Saddam Hussein recently paid substantial sums to the families of several of the suicide bombers as well. Is the pattern clear yet? Some of our leaders are helping to operate this deception while they invoke a new world order. They call for unity with the UN against terrorism, and then forces within the UN and our State Department in our nation have been shielding terrorists behind the UN. The objectives of terror are very clear to those who bring terror about. Carlos Margajella, he's the author of the Mini Manual for Urban Guerrillas, was very clear. Writing a book about terrorism and how to bring it about, he said, terrorism is used in a target country in order to destabilize government and gain control. That's the goal. He was a member of Brazil's Communist Party, a close friend of Fidel Castro, and a frequent visitor to Havana in the 60s while the Tricontinental Network was being launched. He was a part of it. He describes the process. First, revolutionary violence and terror. The target government has few alternatives but to crack down. The terrorists then become more aggressive. More terrorists brought about. More violence, robbery, assaults, kidnappings, executions, and this gives government even more reason or excuse to crack down. The formula is clear. The action is in the reaction of government, not in the bombs and the bullets. But unfortunately, the men who hijack and crash the planes, throw the bombs, pull the triggers, they're agents of foreign states. They don't act alone. And those foreign states are shielded by the United Nations. Some of our citizens see only the threat posed by the bombs and the flames by Osama bin Laden and his cohorts. They don't even notice that internationalists are deceiving us and orchestrating terror, at the same time orchestrating our response to terror. And that activity keeps the curtain firmly closed between us and the real United Nations. Let's examine, just for an example, the Puerto Rican terrorist group, the FALN, already known for numerous terrorist bombings. One was the historic Francis Tavern in New York in the late 1970s. They bombed a federal building in New York in 1982. And during the 1970s, the leader of the FALN lived in the United States, a Puerto Rican terrorist named Filberto Ojeda Rios. He was an agent of Fidel Castro, and we knew it. How was he able to function in the United States? A known terrorist and communist? Courtesy of diplomatic immunity granted to him by the Puerto Rican mission to the United Nations. He's not the only one. As a matter of fact, the UN recognizes all of the nations named as terrorist sponsors by our own government, and all these nations, Syria, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya, Sudan, Cuba, dozens of them have missions at the United Nations in New York, just miles from the site of Ground Zero. And their personnel move freely across our borders under diplomatic immunity. The UN is now and has always been a haven for terror. UN peacekeepers have brutalized other innocents around the world, while the terrorists, sponsored by the same people, have taken over governments and slaughtered hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Are these the kind of peacekeepers that we want ruling America through the UN? Where do we stand? Well, the United States has been relatively unscathed until recently. The most effective tool is the apathy of the American people who do not participate in the face of a patient, gradual effort to communize, socialize, and terrorize America into accepting world government. Why have we escaped more serious attacks? They control both sides of the table. The same one-worlders who promote the UN are controlling the international terrorist network. They fear more than anything a backlash from 300 million free and independent American citizens. A critical element in achieving their goals is the empowerment of the UN, and to act as they are today, these internationalist thugs must feel they are very close to accomplishing that. In order to finish the process, Americans must be subdued, disarmed, and we must be led to believe that world government is necessary. The current tool is terrorism. This technique of gradual change will change, ladies and gentlemen. It will change. It will become brutal when sufficient power is accumulated by the UN. Look at all the nations who have been invaded by UN peacekeepers. The first act is to round up all of the weapons and disarm the entire citizenry. The second is to install gun-toting UN guards over the nation's streets. The last formidable foe, the last victim, and the last bastion of freedom is America and our Constitution. There is hope, and there is a solution. The present terrorism crisis is a manufactured one. The perpetrators, while politically and economically powerful, are relatively few in number. There was a recent survey called The State of Disunion, a survey of American political culture, and that also gives us great hope. This survey of a large number of Americans in Middle America indicated high support for the American creed, the virtues that contributed to our nation's strength and success. 94% of those who were polled agreed that it's important to teach children, quote, that America's contribution is one of expanding freedom for more and more people. 92% agreed that children should be taught that, quote, our founders limited the power of government so government would not intrude too much in the lives of its citizens. Indeed, there is hope. So what's the solution? The John Birch Society exposed terrorists and their sponsors in the 1960s. We promoted a video on terrorism, one of the first, No Place to Hide, in the 1970s when it was not popular. We published groundbreaking information on international terrorism in the 1980s, including reviews of Claire Sterling's book, when it was still hidden from the American people, and the international terrorist network was scoffed at by our administrations. We revealed the truth behind the Oklahoma City bombing and the Middle East connection there in the 1990s, even naming Osama bin Laden. And today the John Birch Society stands at the forefront. We are exposing the real enemies of freedom and proposing the right solutions to terrorism. We know the enemy. We've been their chief opponent for 43 years. And most importantly, the John Birch Society has a plan. First, you need to access the information that we have made available. Read the New American, purchase the literature. Second, realize that totalitarian control is the plan, and the primary weapon to accomplish world government is the United Nations. Finally, awaken your fellow Americans and arm them with the truth about the war on terrorism and the United Nations. Don't sit in silence and watch this happen to you, your children, and your grandchildren. Why should we fight? For our nation, for our forefathers, for our families, and for generations to come. My family are a few of my reasons for being here today. What's the best method to join in the battle? Join a Get Us Out of the United Nations Committee now. Participate in an organized effort to accomplish what individuals cannot by working alone. Help us to finish the job. Help us to awaken the American people and to pull the United Nations and terrorists out from behind the curtain of deception. Organization is the key to building resistance. We must grow. It starts with you. It starts right now. It starts right here. Get involved, and let's cut terrorism off at the root.